All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the 10 deaths of Wolverine, which this is actually starting to make a lot more sense now. So you guys were right. We should have stuck with it for a little bit longer and then kind of waited. I guess about the halfway mark is usually when stories start to make sense, although I wish writers would kind of make stories make sense to a degree within the first like 1 or 2 issues. But nonetheless, so what this does here, instead of picking up with like Moira Mactaggert or with this phalanx version of Wolverine. Instead, we end up picking up with X-23 Laura Kinney and with Scout. Now, here's the thing about this. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Scout, this is Gabby. So Laura Kinney is a clone of Wolverine. Gabby is a clone of Laura Kinney. It's kind of weird, right? Like 3 generations of clones. Or I guess 2 generations of clones. So the thing about this is that with Gabby, she is her own character. She has her own thing going on. She has for quite some time. In the Old Man Logan storylines with Jeff Lemire, one of the things that was hit at is that in the Old Man Logan universe, that Gabby had some kind of a shady and sinister past, that she was sort of instrumental and it caused all kinds of problems, different things like that. We never really got the ins and outs of that. And in fact, Jeff Lemire and Andrea Sorrentino had basically left before that plot line could be wrapped up. I don't recall if it was ever really finished, but we never saw it come to fruition anyway. Instead of Gabby basically being the reason why Laura Kinney died, seemingly, what you end up getting is basically Gabby who kind of becomes a superhero, right? So it seemed like that whole concept was more of a reason to justify, 1, why she existed, and 2, the character arc that she would experience, which is redemption. It's kind of hard to give a character a redemption story arc if you don't really see what it is that they're redeeming themselves from. But nonetheless, it's just one of those things, right? So the idea here is that while they're kind of hanging out, of course, they're met by Charles Xavier. And the reason why this happens is because, as you guys know, Wolverine himself, he's basically in Krakoa with his mind sent into the past, and that's the whole story involving the 10 lives of Wolverine. This version of Wolverine that we see here in the 10 deaths, we don't know what's going on here. We simply just know it's some version of Wolverine and things seem kind of shady and we don't really have the details or the ins and outs. But because it is a version of Wolverine, the best people suited to track him down and to either kill him or bring him in are basically his clones, his counterparts, right? So that's why Laura Kinney's contacted. Scout, of course, chooses to go with her, and they'll actually grab one other person, although we won't find out who that is until later on. And so what we end up doing is basically shifting over to Mountain View, California. Now, one of the things that we know is that Moira is after this guy, Mr. Shakladar, and then we know that Wolverine's after him as well. We didn't know why, but we'll actually find out here. Instead, what they're doing is basically a giant product launch. So he's just one of the many people out there that run some kind of a tech company that seems to be pretty far ahead of like Silicon Valley out in San Francisco. And that's one of the things that I do want to point out here. By and large, whenever it comes to like tech companies, Stark Industries is pretty much the most advanced, but you have some that are very, very, very close. Despite the fact that he was depicted as a buffoon in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in the comics, Justin Hammer and Hammer Industries, they're not far behind Stark. They're pretty close to Stark. I mean, they're not really able to create Iron Man technology in the same way Tony Stark can, but the thing about this is that in terms of almost every other form of technology, Hammer's not that far behind. The thing about this is basically the CIA, right? Dolores Ramirez, who you guys might recall as someone who is basically working for the CIA as part of their anti-mutant task force that's monitoring Krakoa, Wolverine, Moira Mactaggert, and all that kind of stuff. She actually tells this guy they have information that there is a credible threat against Shakladar. Of course, the guy refuses to bail because his biggest concern is if he were to leave the stage right now and he were to not be there for their product launch, then it could actually end up seeing a drop in their stock value. And of course, shareholders would lose a ton of money. Shareholders would sell their stock. The company's value would plummet even further. And then you're in the downward spiral of a company, or at least a publicly traded company, basically going bankrupt. So that's kind of the danger when your company's publicly traded. Perception is everything. That's why it's kind of a big thing. But nonetheless, what you end up having, of course, is because he refuses to leave, the CIA can't just take him, right? They can't just whisk him off because it's not one of those things where he's like under arrest or anything like that. And technically speaking, they're not really supposed to be operating inside the United States anyway. So honestly, everything would just kind of be blown wide open. Instead, what they've done is contacted the local police in order to ensure that the entire area is protected. And then in turn, when one of the cops comes showing up, they just come blasting through, right? I mean, one of the guys is like, damn, that cop's hauling ass, man. Like, is he gonna stop? And literally it's this futuristic, I guess, alternate version of Wolverine who basically starts attacking all these different guys. When that goes on, basically like all these sirens start going off. Seemingly the fire alarms are activated here. The whole place panics and everybody bails, right? So it's kind of the worst case, or at least one of the worst case scenarios anyway. But Wolverine's like literally attacking all these guys and basically taking them out. What they end up doing is getting Shakladar to a helicopter, only for us to find out that it's basically been piloted or being piloted by Moira Mactaggert. And that's when we end up learning here that Moira Mactaggert was kind of operating behind the scenes. That yes, the CIA is currently after Moira Mactaggert, but one of the things that she had done, which is a stroke of genius, is she had leaked information to the Central Intelligence Agency that somebody was going after Shakladar, specifically a mutant. And so with them being an anti-mutant task force, the idea likely would have been to take Shakladar into protective custody, but also use his location in a relatively accessible place as bait for whoever was hunting him, and then capture that person and then do whatever it is they were going to do, experiment on them, interrogate them, whatever it happens to be. The other thing about this though, and this is what's interesting in terms of Moira hitting it on, is that she comes to the realization that this version of Wolverine that's after her, what she calls the Omega Wolverine, is basically from the future, right? It's like a version of Wolverine from the future as essentially an assassin sent to take out Moira Mactaggert and Shakladar. Now, as you guys probably know from our coverage of the Jonathan Hickman stories, the House of X and Powers of X, in the far-flung future, right, 1,000 years from now, mutants basically lose. And mutants have, for the most part, been all but wiped out by humanity. And so it's not as though humanity would then, in turn, send a mutant into the past. Because if humanity sent a mutant into the past, there'd be no way of guaranteeing that that mutant wouldn't alter history in order to ensure that mutants actually come out on top and defeat humanity. And so this mutant being sent here into the past basically means that mutants have it out for Moira Mactaggert. The only reason why a mutant would be sent from the future and into the past to kill Moira Mactaggert is because she's still a credible threat. And what she does is she comes to the realization that if this mutant is also after Shakladar, then it basically means they seemingly end up winning. That she doesn't die here in the present, she doesn't die in the here and now, that even if she does, whatever she creates with Shakladar goes on to be a credible threat against mutants. So all they've basically done here is sent back a giant letter with purple wording on it that says, you basically ended up winning, so now we're gonna try to stop you, right? That's basically the case. And that's one of the things that Hickman kind of told us to a degree, right? And Benjamin Percy's basically confirming here that the war between the humans and the mutants and the post-humans is basically inevitable. It is going to happen. It is a thing that simply cannot be stopped. That's one of those things that Marvel's kind of hit on over the years, right? Days of Future Past, Days of Future Present, Here Comes Tomorrow, like all those different stories have basically hit to this idea that like there may be a war between humans and mutants and maybe some other group in the future, but usually it's always averted. What Hickman said is, no, there is no way to avert that. The paths of humans and mutants will inevitably collide at some point in the future, and when that happens, war will break out. The post-humans are a whole different beast. The post-humans, as we know, are basically humans who have basically been modified, right? They are genetically altered humans who have basically been given powers. In the end and in the future, they will effectively overtake baseline humanity. So there will only be post-humans and mutants, and then eventually mutants will be destroyed. And then with that being the case, all there is post-humans who will achieve a kind of technological singularity that will draw the attention of the Phalanx, who will absorb humanity and Earth into their covenant, right? That's what the post-humans are shooting for, right? Just technologically advanced humans. And so because of that, while Moira Mactaggert doesn't know the full extent by which the future will take shape, what she does know is the fact that a mutant assassin being sent to the past means she's a threat. And so she basically continues on her path, right? Because again, the whole goal of Moira Mactaggert here is to basically end the existence of mutants prematurely so that a war never takes place between the two, right? Basically prevent mutants from coming into existence to ensure that mutants are never wiped out, so that they as individuals can live their own their own lives as humans, and then eventually post-humans and so on, as opposed to just being killed, which kind of makes sense. If you're a mutant, would you rather live your life without powers or be dead with powers, right? Which one would you rather have? And most people would rather just continue living their lives even if they don't have powers. And so because of that, one of the things that happens is where Shakladar is a little hesitant on what's happening here, she tells him like, turn on the news, right? And that's when he sees the broadcast of what's going on with regards to like this Phalanx Wolverine and all that kind of stuff, this assassin from the future, right? Omega Wolverine. That's when he ends up seeing what's happening. And then she basically spills the beans about seemingly everything. She tells him the whole 9 yards, right? Everything that goes on. Now, the implication here is when she says everything, she means everything. So talking to Charles Xavier, the multiple lives she's lived in the past, things along those lines, and where she expected him to almost kind of turn against it or to say, I can't have a hand in this. Instead, he's like, okay, let's get to work. Now, this is an important thing because on the surface and without much detail in terms of what his inner thought process is, it points to the idea that mutants are largely just considered a credible threat by basically everyone. Everybody sees mutants as an issue and as a danger. This was really the case back in the day before Krakoa, when you just had mutants existing in different places across the globe and nobody knew who was a mutant and who wasn't. That was a little scary for the average person because it was one of those things where maybe your child is born a mutant, or maybe some kid in your child's class is born a mutant and explodes, right? Has the ability to let off huge amounts of energy, detonates accidentally, and then wipes out the entire school and 3 city blocks. There was no way to know if that was the case, so it was a little scary that way. Having all the mutants largely consolidated in Krakoa gave the average person a peace of mind, at least as long as their country was allowing mutants to leave. It gave them a peace of mind in the sense that they didn't have to worry about their school being blown to pieces and, along with 3 city blocks. But then it created a bigger issue because people started worrying, if all these mutants are consolidated into one location and no one can see what they're doing, what if they're building an army to use against humanity, right? So one fear gave birth to another. And so that's where things are a little wild, is because ultimately Shakladar is like, sure, right, let's just do this whole thing. And so they end up basically working together on essentially some form of technological advancement. And one of the funny things that he asked, and she really expected him to ask this, was, like, don't you think this is a little bit risky for us to be playing God? And she said, well, if you want to go down that path, then the logic applies that God created a species capable of playing God. So if anything, if God exists and we're capable of doing this, it's because God wanted us to. And so it's one of those things where it's kind of like assuaging his concerns in that way, and the two of them basically continue on. Now, at that point, we basically switch back to Omega Wolverine, who of course is still in the whole facility and fighting the various members of the CIA and so on and so forth, and basically overtakes them. But then suddenly he's met by Laura Kinney and Scout, and then of course Dakin, his biological son, like the son of Wolverine. And that's when he really starts talking and actually having conversations with them. That was one of the elements of the mystery and intrigue surrounding this guy. Is he just like some kind of phalanx robot, right? Like some kind of automaton where he just goes into the past, executes a series of commands, goes back to the present, and then that's basically it, or back to the future rather, and that's basically it. Really incapable of speech or anything along those lines. No, that's the thing. We didn't really know what the whole deal with this guy was. Dakin confirms it. Dakin's like, I can tell by your scent, I can tell by the way you fight, I can tell by the way you talk. It really is you. And that's when he's like, we're here to bring you in. We're here to stop you. But one of the things he says is I know how all of you die. I know exactly how every single one of you die. None of you make it. None of you guys make it to the end. You are executed. You are killed. Now, we don't know exactly how they die. We simply just know that they do. And in fact, it's interesting because he refuses to pop his claws. He literally pulls his claws back in. And even when he says this, I know how all of you dies, there's almost a bit of sadness, right? Remorse, even some shame in the fact that he's giving them this information. Not in the sense that he's ashamed of spilling this information to them, but it's almost like a personal shame in the sense that he couldn't save them. But it is him. It is actually Wolverine from the future. And so that's kind of the crazy thing, is the question has to be asked, why was he sent here to the past, right? And of course, it stands to reason to stop Moira Mactaggert before she can seemingly end the entirety of humanity, or at least the entirety of the mutant population. And so what we end up doing is jumping to the Preserve 1,000 years in the future. And remember, the Preserve is kind of the base of operations for Moira Mactaggert. And so what ends up happening is Moira has seemingly survived this far into the future. We don't know exactly how she did it. We just simply know that she has, right? I mean, remember, one of the things that's put off about Moira Mactaggert is that she seemingly is immortal, that once she dies, then her life basically starts back over again. But one of the things that this may have been something that was explained and it kind of escapes me here. I think that she's basically she has enhanced longevity, right? She is immortal in terms of age. She once her mutant power kicks in, she'll never die of old age, right? She'll just keep on living and living and living until she dies by some form or fashion. Now, again, that's just the nature of her. It's almost like she's an external. One thing to keep in mind is, remember, just because a mutant's immortal does not mean they're invulnerable. The two are not mutually exclusive. They're two separate things, right? Invulnerability and immortality are not the same. But where Wolverine basically meets up with her, apparently he's been chasing her all this time and he finally catches up with her, right? And it's why? He's like, I've been waiting to find out why all this had to come to pass in the first place. And she's like, then you have your answer, right? It's me. I'm the reason why all this happened. And she's like, I've been waiting too, right? I've been waiting to see the look on your face, right? I've been waiting for you to find me so I can see the look on your face when I finally kill the last mutant on the face of the planet, right? That basically Wolverine is the last one. Now, what this represents here seemingly is a turning point, that it's entirely possible that if things are done correctly, this future could actually be averted. Hickman told us it can't. But Hickman's no longer in charge of the X-Men anymore. So it's one of those instances where Marvel could just change what Hickman said and be like, actually guys, the war can be stopped, right? The day can be saved. And that's basically it. We don't fully know. But I will say that while it took us getting to really like 3 issues to get to this point, the story's getting really, really cool. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.